The cameras were rolling, the audience was cheering, and then 16-year-old Ethan Roberts stood at the Family Feud podium with an emptiness beside him that no one could see but that he felt in every breath, every heartbeat, every moment of every day since the accident that had taken his twin brother Noah and left Ethan wondering why he had survived when the better half of himself had died. When Steve Harvey asked about times when you feel incomplete, Ethan's response, delivered with the hollow voice of someone who had lost not just a brother but the other half of his soul, made the entire studio understand they were witnessing grief so profound it defied comprehension. "Every day since my brother died," Ethan had said, the words carrying 16 years of shared existence followed by 8 months of devastating loneliness. "I feel like half of me is missing because it is." Ethan Roberts had been born 14 minutes after his identical twin brother Noah, entering the world to find his other half already waiting for him, and from that moment they had been inseparable in ways that people who weren't twins could never fully understand. They had shared everything: a womb, a crib, a bedroom, friends, interests, dreams, and a connection that went beyond words to something cellular, something that made them feel like one person in two bodies rather than two separate individuals who happened to look alike. The twin bond that Ethan and Noah had shared was something that even their parents had found mysterious and beautiful. As infants, they had slept better when placed in the same crib, had cried when separated for more than a few hours, and had seemed to communicate through gestures and sounds that no one else could interpret. As toddlers, they had developed their own private language that included words and phrases that made perfect sense to them but were incomprehensible to everyone else. Their connection had only grown stronger as they got older. They had played identical roles in school plays, had joined the same sports teams, had chosen the same electives and extracurricular activities, but their bond went far beyond shared interests to something that seemed almost supernatural. They could sense each other's physical discomfort from across a room, had been known to wake up at the same time from the same nightmares, and often had identical reactions to people and situations they encountered. Growing up, Ethan and Noah had been mirror images of each other in almost every way. Physically identical down to a small scar on their left hands from the same childhood accident, they had also shared the same sense of humor, the same academic strengths and struggles, the same athletic abilities, and the same way of thinking through problems. Teachers had struggled to tell them apart, friends had given up trying to distinguish between them, and even their parents sometimes had to look twice to determine which twin they were addressing. Their identical appearance had been both a source of fun and occasional frustration. They had enjoyed confusing substitutes teachers and new acquaintances, had sometimes switched classes or dates as pranks, and had developed an elaborate system of signals that allowed them to help each other in situations where one twin was struggling. But they had also occasionally felt burdened by being seen as one unit rather than two individuals, had sometimes competed for separate recognition and individual achievements. But beyond their physical similarity was an emotional and psychological connection that had defined both of their identities. They had their own language of glances and gestures that could communicate complex thoughts without words. They often finished each other's sentences, had the same dreams on the same nights, and seemed to feel each other's physical and emotional pain across any distance. When one twin was hurt or upset, the other would immediately sense it, even when they were in different places. The accident had happened on a Tuesday night in March, 8 months earlier, when the twins were driving home from basketball practice in Noah's car. Ethan had been in the passenger seat, exhausted from a particularly intense training session, when a drunk driver had run a red light and struck the driver's side of their vehicle. The impact had been devastating and immediate. Noah had been killed instantly, while Ethan had survived with relatively minor injuries that felt like a cosmic injustice given the magnitude of his loss. The details of that night were seared into Ethan's memory with perfect, terrible clarity. They had been discussing their plans for spring break, debating whether to spend the vacation with their family in Colorado or accept an invitation to visit their cousins in California. Noah had been excited about the possibility of skiing, while Ethan had been more interested in the beach. It had been such an ordinary conversation, the kind of casual planning discussion they had thousands of times before, with no indication that it would be their last. The randomness of survival had been almost as traumatic as the loss itself. There had been no heroic choice, no moment of sacrifice, no logical reason why one twin had lived while the other had died. It had simply been a matter of positioning. Ethan had been sitting on the side of the car that had been spared the worst of the impact, while Noah had been sitting where the other vehicle had struck. The difference between life and death had been measured in inches and seconds, not in worth or deservingness or the will to survive. The 8 months since the accident had been the longest and loneliest period of Ethan's life. For 16 years, he had never been truly alone, even when they were in different rooms, different classes, or different activities. He had always known that Noah was somewhere nearby, that his other half was living parallel experiences and would be available to share thoughts, feelings, and observations as soon as they were reunited. Now Ethan woke up every morning to the crushing realization that Noah was gone, that he would spend the rest of his life as a single person rather than half of a pair. The grief Ethan experienced was unlike anything he had ever imagined possible. It wasn't just sadness over the loss of a loved one. It was the feeling that his very identity had been severed, that he was fundamentally incomplete in ways that made normal functioning almost impossible. Everything he did, every conversation he had, every experience he encountered was filtered through the awareness that Noah should be there too, that they should be processing life together the way they always had. Simple daily activities had become sources of fresh grief. Brushing his teeth while looking in the mirror reminded him that he would never again see Noah's identical reflection standing beside him. Eating meals felt wrong because they had always shared food and discussed their days together. Watching television or listening to music felt hollow because they had always reacted to entertainment together, building on each other's jokes and observations. Ethan's parents, David and Sarah Roberts, had been devastated by Noah's death and deeply concerned about Ethan's emotional well-being. They had arranged grief counseling, had tried to maintain family traditions and routines, had worked to support Ethan through the worst period of his life. But they had also struggled to understand the unique nature of twin loss, the way that losing an identical twin was different from other types of grief because it involved the loss of someone who had been literally part of Ethan's identity since before birth. School had become particularly difficult for Ethan because every day involved encounters with people who had known him and Noah as a unit. Teachers would sometimes call him by his brother's name, friends would start conversations expecting both twins to be present, and there were constant reminders of the life they had shared. Ethan had considered transferring schools to escape these daily reminders, but the thought of going somewhere where nobody remembered Noah felt like a betrayal of his brother's memory. The most difficult part of Ethan's grief was the survivor's guilt that consumed him daily. He couldn't understand why he had lived while Noah had died, couldn't escape the feeling that he should have been able to protect his twin brother somehow, couldn't stop wondering whether Noah would have handled survival better if their positions had been reversed. The randomness of the tragedy made it impossible to find meaning or purpose in the loss, leaving Ethan with questions that had no answers and guilt that seemed impossible to resolve. The Family Feud appearance had been arranged by Ethan's aunt, his mother's sister, who had thought that participating in a family activity might help Ethan reconnect with joy and normalcy. The family had hesitated about appearing on the show so soon after Noah's death, uncertain whether Ethan was ready for such a public experience, but Ethan had agreed to participate partly because he thought Noah would have wanted him to, and partly because he needed to prove to himself that he could still function in normal social situations. During the pre-show preparations, Ethan had been quiet and withdrawn, participating in the required activities but clearly struggling with the energy and enthusiasm that game shows typically required. The production team had been sensitive to his obvious grief, understanding from his family that he had recently lost his twin brother, but they hadn't fully grasped the unique nature of twin loss and the way it had affected every aspect of Ethan's identity and functioning. The game had been proceeding slowly and carefully. The Roberts family was competing against the Martinez family from Texas, and both sides had been playing with appropriate energy, though everyone had been clearly conscious of Ethan's emotional state and had tried to include him without putting pressure on him to perform beyond his capacity. Ethan had participated minimally, giving brief answers when his turn came but otherwise standing quietly at the family podium, present in body but clearly struggling to be fully engaged. But when it came time for the category Times When You Feel Incomplete, and it was Ethan's turn at the buzzer, the question had struck directly at the core of his daily experience and the grief that defined every moment of his existence. Steve Harvey had approached the podium with unusual gentleness, clearly aware that this young man was dealing with something profound and difficult. "All right, Ethan," Steve had said softly, "times when you feel incomplete. What comes to mind?" Ethan had looked at Steve, then at his family, then back at Steve with eyes that held depths of pain that seemed impossible for someone so young to carry. "Every day since my brother died," Ethan had said, his voice hollow but clear. "I feel like half of me is missing because it is." The studio had fallen into the kind of silence that indicated everyone present understood. They had just heard something that transcended game show entertainment and entered the realm of human tragedy and profound loss. Steve had paused, clearly moved by the simple honesty of Ethan's response and the weight of grief it contained. "Ethan," Steve had said gently, "can you tell me about your brother?" Ethan had taken a shaky breath, seeming to gather strength from some internal source. "Noah was my twin," Ethan had said. "We were identical. We did everything together. We had the same thoughts, the same dreams. He died in a car accident 8 months ago, and I survived, and I don't understand why." Steve had moved closer to Ethan, his expression showing deep compassion and understanding. "That's called survivor's guilt," Steve had said softly, "and it's one of the hardest things any human being can go through. I keep thinking I should have died instead," Ethan had continued, the words pouring out as if he had been waiting for someone to ask. "He was better at everything than I was. He was kinder, funnier, more talented. People loved him more. If one of us had to die, it should have been me." The pain in Ethan's voice had affected everyone in the studio, creating an atmosphere of shared sorrow and empathy. Steve had looked at Ethan with an expression that mixed heartbreak with determination. "Ethan," Steve had said, "can I tell you something? Your brother didn't die because he was worse than you, and you didn't survive because you were better than him. Sometimes terrible things happen that have nothing to do with who deserves what." Steve had paused, clearly emotional himself. "But I want you to think about this," Steve had continued. "You're not living for two people now. You're living with two hearts, your heart and his heart. You're carrying his love, his dreams, his memory. That doesn't make you incomplete. That makes you twice as full." Ethan had looked up at Steve with tears beginning to flow. "But I don't know how to be just me," Ethan had said. "We were always Ethan and Noah, or the twins. I've never been just Ethan. I don't know who that person is." Steve had knelt down slightly to be closer to Ethan's eye level. "Ethan," Steve had said, "you're not just Ethan. You're Ethan who carries Noah's memory. You're Ethan who knows what it means to love someone completely. You're Ethan who understands loss in a way that makes you more compassionate, more appreciative, more aware of how precious life is." Steve had begun removing his suit jacket, the same jacket he wore for every taping. "Ethan," Steve had said, "this jacket represents something special today. It represents understanding that when we lose someone we love, we don't lose half of ourselves, we gain their love as part of who we become." As Steve had placed the jacket around Ethan's shoulders, he had continued speaking. "Noah is not gone from your life. He's part of your life in a different way now. Every good thing you do, every moment of joy you experience, every success you achieve, he's part of that because he's part of you." Ethan had looked down at the jacket, then back up at Steve. "How do I stop feeling guilty for being alive?" Ethan had asked. "You honor his memory by living fully," Steve had replied. "You stop feeling guilty by understanding that your survival was a gift, not because you deserved it more than he did, but because it means his love gets to continue in the world through you." Steve had turned to address the studio audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve had announced, "Ethan Roberts is carrying one of the heaviest burdens any person can carry, the loss of someone who was literally part of his identity. But what he's showing us is that love doesn't end with death, it transforms." The game had resumed, but it had been transformed. Ethan's family had played with renewed unity, celebrating every point as a victory, not just for their team but for Ethan's courage in sharing his grief and beginning to process his survival. When Steve had asked the final question about things that make life worth living, Ethan had looked around the studio with something approaching hope and answered, "Knowing that love is stronger than death." The episode had ended with Ethan wearing Steve's jacket, surrounded by his family, while the studio audience gave them a standing ovation that honored not just their game show participation, but Ethan's courage in facing the most difficult loss imaginable with grace and the beginning of acceptance. After the cameras stopped rolling, Ethan had spent time with Steve discussing grief, survivor's guilt, and the unique challenges of twin loss. Steve had shared resources for young people dealing with traumatic loss and had emphasized that healing didn't mean forgetting Noah, but learning to carry his memory in ways that honored their bond while allowing Ethan to build a life that included joy and hope. The episode aired 4 months later and became one of the most meaningful discussions of grief and survival ever featured on family television. Grief counseling organizations and twin support groups had used Ethan's story to help other survivors understand that healing from profound loss is possible without dishonoring the memory of those who have died. Ethan had kept Steve's jacket as a symbol of the moment when he began to understand that carrying Noah's memory didn't have to mean carrying guilt, that survival could be transformed from a burden into a responsibility to live fully in honor of the love they had shared. The jacket represented his growing understanding that he wasn't half a person without Noah, but a whole person who had been shaped and strengthened by the experience of loving someone completely, even though that love now had to exist in memory rather than daily presence. Because that's what love looks like when it survives death and transforms into memory. That's what strength sounds like when it chooses to honor loss by embracing life. And that's what happens when a 16-year-old boy learns that losing his twin brother didn't make him incomplete. It made him the keeper of a love story that would define the rest of his life in the most beautiful and meaningful way possible.